This is actually a new experience for me, speaking on the other side of the fence to how I normally would. I should be breathing quite heavily and sounding like Darth Vader. Previously, I've been sitting as a head of corporate strategy for Ergon Energy, one of Australia's largest power companies by geography. Every power company in the world is largest in something. It seems to be the engineer's way. We've got to find that statistic that gives us that credibility. We had the largest geography of a single network. But we also had the privilege of having the most dispersed asset base and the greatest amount of assets per customer. So over 1 million poles supplying electricity to under 700,000 customers. So it's nearly getting towards 2 poles per customer. So we had to find really smart ways of doing work. The asset base didn't justify the existence. The customer base didn't justify the existence of the assets. And in the 70s, there was a push in the state to connect everybody. It was the right of citizens to have power. And so these grids just grew and grew. We invented, I don't know if we did, technology was invented to run single wires to consumers. There'd be 50 kilometres of single wire to get to a ball pump that would replace a windmill to get water into a trough for a bunch of cattle. The cost of that network obviously doesn't sustain the energy delivered through it. So in the light of all of that, Ergon reconsidered how it was managing its asset base. And the concept of the virtual world management system grew out of that. So taking a step back, I'm actually not going to, having crossed the fence and now being Darth Vader, a vendor, supplier to the electricity sector, I'm not going to stand here and sell, at least not overtly, subtly perhaps. What is infrastructure? And potentially challenge our thinking of what infrastructure is available to us to use today to better manage our infrastructure, your infrastructure. So we understand the electricity grid as infrastructure. We're comfortable with that term. So infrastructure is, according to Google, the basic physical and organisational structures and facilities needed for the operation of society or enterprise. So one couldn't argue that our society today doesn't depend on electricity infrastructure. It's probably the most important. Coming from the electrical sector, we can say it's more important than telecommunications, it's more important than anything else because all the others depend on electricity. You turn off the grid, telecommunications will last until the batteries start running out or until the diesel in the backup generators expire. So the entire economy relies on electricity. We don't need to talk about that here, we know it. But are there other infrastructures, higher order infrastructures that are built on that electricity infrastructure, which in turn can help us manage? So I know that's a good definition of infrastructure because I Googled it, and there were 345 million other definitions of infrastructure on Google. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, you can't trust everything you read on the internet. At least that's what it says on Wikipedia. So the word infrastructure itself is actually relatively new. Again, according to Google's Ngram, which plots how words are used, 1950 it starts becoming prevalent and then it peaks around 2000. So it's not an age-old world. The cavemen weren't talking about their infrastructure. So what is it? Well, here's a couple of thoughts of infrastructure from my perspective. It crosses traditional boundaries of collaboration. So if you were to get a bunch of people together in a room who don't normally talk, they would probably find a way to generate some new infrastructure out of existing pieces. A classic example could be weather monitoring infrastructure. We tend to think of those as being the big radar stations we see on the tops of hills. Well, recently we've seen GPS technology, the same stuff that navigates your mobile phone in your car, as one of the best weather sensors. It can determine the temperature globally by monitoring the delays of satellite signals to GPS base stations, and that correlates to pressure in the atmosphere and ultimately to the temperature of the air. So we now end up with a full 3-dimensional model of the Earth's temperature, or the atmospheric temperature from GPS signals. Who would have thought satellites that deliver GPS positioning capability would lead to technology that is a weather sensor? The other thing about infrastructure is it's available to everybody who wants to access it. It's not being built primarily for one party. People can freely, not freely in the sense of no money, although everybody who blogs on the internet wants everything to be free, but free to get. You can go there, you can find it, and find a way to pay for it. Infrastructure is also uneconomical for a single party to build. If we were to sit down and say, well, I'm going to build a new business and I need electricity, so I'm going to build myself a nuclear power station and all the transmission lines and power lines to get it to me, it's just not feasible. We know these things intuitively. It's also shared between disparate stakeholders, so completely unrelated industries access infrastructure, the common infrastructure. So it could be a dairy farm, you could be Amazon, and you'll use the same freeway to get your goods to market. Infrastructure's access price is not driven by value, but by cost, effectively, marginal cost. So when we're looking at the value of access to the electricity grid, some people have huge value out of it. It might be a hospital who is saving lives at the rate of X million dollars per life, or it could be somebody who's selling comic books from a store. The value proposition for each of those are fundamentally different, and yet they're paying the same price for electricity. And all new infrastructure tends to leverage new technology. So if we were to look around the world today at where rapid technology evolution was occurring, we'd probably find signs of where new infrastructure might exist. And that's partly where we want to go today. So if you were to begin a new business right now, what infrastructure would you use? What new things would you just assume are in the fabric of society that you could access to build a new business? And that's what innovators are doing all over the world, entrepreneurs. There's some famous ones today, new businesses coming out of the existence of globally available infrastructure. One of those that's hot on the press, and by mentioning them I don't mean to give allegiance or acceptance in any way, but Uber, depending on where in the world you are. The Uber versus taxi fight gets ugly in reality. Here's a new piece of technology. Taxi industries had to build their own communications networks. They've got their own radio systems inside vehicles, and they're still paying a lot of that stuff off around the world. So this concept that now there's affordable, always connected infrastructure that you can get on a smartphone in a car, and it can navigate you to someone who wants to pay you to drive somewhere else, and electronic payment can happen through the phone from your credit card with no money changing hands physically at the scene. All of those pieces of that puzzle are an amazing collection of infrastructure components put together to build a new business. So let's look at signs of where we might find some new infrastructure emerging. Who would have thought a computer game could make $1 billion in the first week of sales? $1 billion. That's Grand Theft Auto. Again, I don't mean to show any kind of allegiance. My kids aren't allowed to play this game. But I hear it's a fun game. So Grand Theft Auto relies on some incredible pieces of componentry, including access to the internet for updates of games, and for people to get into it, they want to advertise their scores and compete with their friends online. So the whole economy of this game has been created by pieces of infrastructure that the makers of the game have tapped into. Speaking of the internet, we're seeing cloud technology being discussed in almost every forum. Amazon versus Azure versus Google, fighting it out to be a cloud platform provider, effectively an infrastructure provider of compute that you no longer have to pay for in-house. And talking about always connected, this is the phones versus PC sales. Down the bottom is a prediction up to 2018, about 2/3 of the way through is where we are today at 2015. Phone sales, connected phones, smartphones, outstrip PCs by a factor of 10. Always connected. Probably everyone in the room, or at least 90% of the people in the room, would have a smartphone that is connected to their email, to the internet, and is giving them live feeds. And more we're going to wearable devices where we can actually communicate through our watch, receive alerts, where health fitness indicators that feed back into the internet how we're going health-wise. So one of the emerging infrastructure layers is knowledge infrastructure, and it's a stack on top of all of those other pieces we talked about. So the electricity network and the reliability of that has led to central compute locations where we can trust that computing is going to be running perpetually, connected to communications infrastructure that feeds us information on our smartphones. And this knowledge infrastructure at the top layer of all of this other infrastructure is starting to become available to us to actually consume. 10 years ago, or even less, we had to build all knowledge inside our own companies. Everything we wanted to know, we had to pay for ourselves and get as our own service. In regional Queensland, we deployed our own lightning sensors to work out where lightning was striking on equipment. Now, we can access online weather feeds. AccuWeather, for instance, received 10 billion requests for weather information a day. That business has been enabled by all of the other layers we just talked about. Facebook, I'm not quite sure I'd go as far as saying it's knowledge infrastructure, but it's certainly a way businesses are tapping into their consumers. Most, if not all, power companies in the Western world have a Facebook page. You can go and find out how they're interacting with their clients. Twitter is fundamentally changing the way media is gathered. We can find out things faster on Twitter than we can through regular media agencies. These must be disruptive concepts for the media agencies themselves when they're thinking about who their competition is. Who would have thought it would be an online crowdsourced content gathering system? And then there's products like Google Earth, which have given us all a new insight into the fact that we can basically jump to anywhere in the world and get a sense of what it's like, at least in 2D, some kind of feel. Has that actually gone red already? There you go. Good thing I'm on my second last slide. So virtual reality is accessing the real world online. We believe that's the next level of infrastructure. This real world available to us online would look like the real world, it would behave like the real world, and it would start with, but it would be an evolution. It would have objects that make the real world believable and useful. So this new model of the Earth that we could access online in centimetre accuracy would be useful to many stakeholders. And one only needs to get the imagination juices running. SimCity is a computer game that allows people to simulate the world. Perhaps this is the future of our asset inspection team, sitting in the office, walking their way through that real world. So knowledge infrastructure supports communication. These virtual worlds will become the infrastructure on which we build all future assets, on future businesses. Shared knowledge across government, industry and consumers will be enabled over these virtual worlds. Decisions can be pre-modeled and communicated. So again, you can access the slides later, but there are new things to think about as these new worlds become available. But there's certainly incentives. One of our clients has reduced their vegetation budget, for instance, from $100 million a year to $60 million a year by accessing this virtual world. We've taken over 10 million kilometres of annual driving away from some of our customers by them performing all asset inspections inside a virtual world instead of having to send people out into the field. Sorry, not all asset, a set of asset inspections inside a virtual world instead of sending people into the field to look at assets. And if you can jump to the very end of the slides so the next person begin, I'll skip these. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. As before, we'll take the questions at the end of this session, please. So Unfortunately, Darren White wasn't able to make it, but I'm very pleased to say that Robert Cairns has come